Ben Kerkvliet to come up. Ben is an Emeritus Professor here at the ANU, and he's currently researching forms of public political criticism in Vietnam and how state authorities react to this. His previous research emphasised agrarian politics in the Philippines and Vietnam, leading to the publication The Power of Everyday Politics, How Vietnamese Peasants Transform National Policy. Cornell. I'll hand over to Ben. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank Sango and all the people here at the ANU who are directly involved in this project. Keith and Sarah sitting somewhere, and to the Crawford School. What I'd like to do today is basically two things. Give an overview, summarize the piece that was listed among the readings on the invitation to this event, and then try to suggest how that work can feed into or maybe be of use to the Rupture project. My paper is not dealing specifically with Rupture. The paper that was listed there is a publication on land protests in Vietnam in recent years, roughly from 2000 to 2015. It's part of a larger project, as mentioned by Sango when she refers to my project having to do with public political criticism in contemporary Vietnam. So land is one of the issues that around which there's been a lot of controversy in Vietnam and has prompted, led to numerous protests, very open disagreement by villagers against local and national officials. It all has to, so that's one part of my larger project on public political criticism. I'm also looking at other types of actors in Vietnam, not just villagers. The idea, what happened is, as Vietnam becomes more involved with world economic activities, capitalism, foreign investment, and those kinds of things that have been building over the last 25 or so years, has created new demands on land, farmland. Demands particularly in the form of expanding urban areas, so they need places to build homes and roadways and schools and so forth. And secondly, for factories that are increasingly involved in production, often overseas production, involving foreign investors as well as Vietnamese investors. So the need for that land that put pressure on farmland, especially near or within proximity of urban areas. Laws in Vietnam allow for people to have rights to land, but not own the land. So the government then has a possibility, when there's a demonstrated need from the point of view of the government, to take those farmlands that people have rights to use and convert it from farm to these other purposes. This has created huge problems over the last 15 to 20 years, in that tens of thousands of households have been, in one way or another, sometimes quickly, sometimes over a period of time, have been pushed out of their farming into situations that are not to their liking in many cases. Not all of those tens of thousands of households have protested, but a huge percentage of them have in one form or another. And the paper that was published is trying to look at those protests. How do people go about it, and why? What are their reasons for objecting? And I identified two kind of broad patterns as to how people do it. One is
emphasizing people within a community who are in this situation of suddenly being told their farmland is going to be taken and used for something else that doesn't involve them. They work together. What are we going to do? How are we going to, who do we go to? Where do we seek help? They start first among themselves, talking, deciding where avenues to pursue. We go to local officials and try to get local officials to be accommodating to their needs, to their concerns. Oftentimes that is unsatisfactory, and so they start going higher up the chain of authority, all the way to the national level. Sometimes through petitions and letters, and sometimes physically. People from a village going not only to the nearby town, but also to the provincial capital and on to Hanoi, the national capital. So people, this is one way that people have done this, to protest, kind of community by community. The second way, which is rather unusual in all of the cases that I've looked at, is several communities kind of get together, or people from different parts of the country who are in the same boat, so to speak, converge in a large demonstration in Ho Chi Minh City, where there are national government offices, as well as in Hanoi, where there are national government offices. They come together, they try to make their claims for not being removed from their land or getting better compensation for their land. Oftentimes that's a major complaint, is that the compensation to leave is tiny compared to what people need or think is fair. So those, another unusual feature of the second category of protest is resorting to different degrees of violence, putting their bodies and whatever implements they have on the line to fight and try to stop authorities who are coming in with police troops to actually physically force them off the land. There have been numerous occasions of these kinds of physical, violent confrontations over these land issues. A second type of violence sometimes is villagers resorting to sabotage against the bulldozers, other heavy equipment that's being brought in by provincial or local or even national authorities to push them off the land, because the struggle has been going on for oftentimes not just months but years, and finally government authorities say enough is enough and we're going to push you out. So people try to prevent that by sabotaging the equipment. The reasons why people do this, various forms of protests, both the kinds that are basically community-centered and the kinds that are more collaborative, range from arguing with the authorities that they're the ones violating the law, that the law says this, this, and this, and you folks haven't followed it, and therefore we base our claims on what the law allows and what the law requires of you and allows us to do. Sometimes they get attorneys to help them do that. A second argument as to why they're doing this protesting is what I mentioned earlier about claiming that the compensation being suggested, offered to them, is far too little for what they need. And often, usually actually, they argue, if we must leave the land, we want to be compensated such that when we go to something else, some way, some other part of the vicinity, or have to move completely, we want to be able to live as at least at the level we're living now. And what you're compensating us for doesn't allow us to do that. They also often argue, actually the compensation is teeny compared to what the land is actually worth. Because the valuation process of your use rights compared to what the land will become as urban or factory areas is controversial. How do we set this price? And villagers often say, you're setting it in a way that benefits you guys, but not benefiting us. A third kind of argument is that it's unjust to deprive people of their livelihood. Some people don't want compensation. They want to continue farming. So it's not a matter of how much money you're going to give us. We want to farm. And this is our livelihood. This is the way of our future, of our family. And it's wrong, immoral, that kind of language used to take our livelihood away. And fourthly, an oftentimes argument is it's wrong to take land from us who we ourselves or our parents or our grandparents fought for you folks to have this government, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. We were part of, or our recent ancestors were part of a movement that sided with you, and now you're taking us, our livelihood, our means of living away. This is wrong. It's for all of those other reasons, as well as the fact that we shed blood for this country, and what you're doing is wrong. Reactions of government have varied from being somewhat responsive to people's concerns by oftentimes increasing the compensation, oftentimes finding alternative land for people to continue farming. But those responses have often been inadequate to meet the concerns of a large proportion of the people who have protested. A second kind of response is to kind of tolerate these protests, as I suggested earlier, sometimes for years before the third kind of response kicks in, which is pushing people physically off the land. Real repression, including sometimes arresting people for their persistent involvement in protests. So, how might this study relate to the Rupture project? Well, the how people protest and the reasons they do might be of some value as the project looks at what happens in situations of people being suddenly faced with serious problems due to a dam or some other event that turns upside down their living situation. But there are perhaps some other aspects I've thought about that might relate to the project in terms of the shortfalls of my research. My study was not looking in depth at why some people don't protest, why some people do not do the things that the ones I was looking at do. From my data, I have some inclinations as to why in a community some people get heavily involved, maybe even a large proportion of the community get heavily involved in trying to hang on to their land, to object, but others do not. And I have some tidbit kind of information on those things in numerous places, but really it's not something I really looked at. So maybe looking in the Rupture project into why public protest does not occur or very uneven within a community is something, a line of inquiry that would be of use. Secondly, a shortfall in my work in this project, in that article, is my study was looking at public discontent, how people were publicly trying to oppose the impending confiscation of their land. And despite my interest in the past and research on everyday politics, it's not what I was looking at in this project. And the reason for that, and this goes to a third thing that might be of use to the Rupture project, is to do that kind of everyday, to look at the everyday political dimensions of a community or clusters of community requires long-term, fairly up-close research in ways of interviews and the kinds of documentations you are willing to pursue, the time investment, and the permission from, in some parts of the world anyway, and certainly Vietnam would be one, of being able to do that. So constraints on the research is one reason, in my case, for this project on land protest, made it difficult for me to do that. So it wasn't even something I seriously considered when I started this kind of project. I focused on the public, partly for constraints on research. But again, for the project, if one wants to look at the everyday political dimensions, whether it's protest or accommodation, and not just the public manifestations of what people do, then research constraints have to be kind of figured out, and the opportunities of long-term, up-close research has to be figured out. Thank you.